Hello friends, good morning and welcome to the EduSet Network. Our topic of discussion shall be part of our ongoing series on American literature. And friends, in specific, we are going to talk about the classics of American literature, and we talk about American fiction within that. And friends, for this lecture, we have in the studio with us our subject expert, Professor Bhim Singh Daya, retired professor of English and former Vice Chancellor, Kurukshetra University. And with this very brief introduction, I welcome Sir to the studio. Sir, thank you.
Thank you. Well, there are so many claimants on the classics of American fiction compared to those in poetry and drama. Still, I've tried to select the best well-known, popular classics of American fiction. To begin with, we must understand the kind of American fiction that came up in America. It was not precisely the same as the European or the British fiction. America, you know, as a nation was born much later. The settlement of America began in 1607, means early 17th century. And it took quite some time before the community, settled down and took a shape of society, because arts and literature would follow later, much later, when society has matured itself into a cultured, a civilized community. So it is in the early 18th century that the American novel comes up on the scene. It was natural to have taken about a century to produce something which could be shown to the rest of the world. American fiction also had to be different from the European because of a few factors. One of the factors was its being a vast continent and almost uninhabited, except for a handful of Red Indians. Compared to the size of the continent, the population of the Red Indians was not really very large. So it offered romantic possibilities. So rather than novel, which focuses on everyday life, routine life, ordinary people, that is the popular subject of the novel. But in romance, it has to be something unusual, something unprecedented. So you find there the use of supernatural, the use of archetypal characters, the use of supermen and women. So this is one of the elements of the American novel, the element of romance. So you may call it historical romance to begin with, because after all, you will be writing about something. And the American writers were writing about their own history. They were fascinated by the very idea of their own settlement. How on such a virgin continent, such a vast continent, we came to be thrown by the destiny stroke, and what kind of life is there they encountered. So romance is one element. Second is history, as I said. So we may call it historical romance to begin with. The early phase of the American novel is marked by the narratives which are best described as historical romances. The first significant historical romance is by James Fenimore Cooper. Cooper was a prolific writer. He wrote a large number of novels, and these novels are called leather stocking novels. Leather stocking. Because all of these novels deal with the Red Indians, their life on the continent, and how the race of the Red Indians had to face the superior civilized people of Europe who came there and crushed the Red Indians. They wiped out the entire race, more or less. And as one of the characters in the novel we are going to talk about says, technologically they were superior. So how could the arrow match a bullet? Bullet can fire at a distance. Bullet can fire accurately. Bullet can kill more than one people. But arrows were compared to this a primitive weapon, and therefore these Red Indians with their arrows were not able to match the bullets of the European settlers. Hence, they were losing badly, and they fought a losing battle. So, in this context, the important novel, I think, is The Last of the Mohicans. Last of the Mohicans, Mohicans. So you can see from the name, it was this kind of names they had among the Red Indian community. So The Last of the Mohicans is a novel about the wiping out of this race of the Red Indians. And we have a significant as a quotation from this novel, where the character is Chingachuk. You can see the name again, Red Indian, Chingachgook, Chingachuk. So Chingachuk makes this remark. He says the fate of the Indian has been sealed by the technological superiority of the white men and the inequality of the contest between the bullet and the arrow. And then there is another quotation by the same character, Chingachuk. He says, all of my family departed, each in his turn, to the land of spirits. I am on the hilltop and must go down into the valley. And when Uncas, another character, Uncas, Uncas follows in my footsteps, there will no longer be any of the blood of the Sagamores, one of the communities or families. For my boy is the last of the Mohicans. So this becomes the title of the novel, The Last of the Mohicans, written by James Fenimore Cooper. This came out in 1926. You see, two important characters in this are one, Duncan Haywood, and the female character is Alice Munro. Alice Munro, Munroe. Now, in their, you see, marriage or in their union, they become the founding parents of the American race on the continent. So this becomes their larger significance. And as I said in the very beginning, that is another feature of romance, that here characters do not remain individuals. Characters gather larger meanings and they come to stand for larger themes or issues or national, characters. So that is what happens in The Last of Mohicans, written by James Fenimore Cooper. So this is a path breaker sort of novel, 1826, and we may say that the first classic American novel, and this will be best described as historical romance as against the novel. Novel proper, in fact, comes up in the 18th century, where morals and manners preoccupy the stage, where settled family life becomes the subject of the narrative. No adventures, no supernatural, no going out of the routine. So you have that settled, comfortable life, or even uncomfortable, but settled. That's what the novel is about, which comes up, as I said, later in the 18th century in England, but in America in the 19th, in fact, 19th to later, because this is early 19th, 1826, but you have historical romances, not the British sort of novel. Well, the next in the line is a similar, again, historical romance by Washington Irving. And the novel is The Conquest of Granada. Very famous, there was a movie also on it. The Conquest of Granada in 1829, just 3 years after. Now, Irving was a versatile personality. Irving was an intellectual, he was a poet, he was a dramatist, he was a short story writer, even a novel writer. Then he was a diplomat and so many other things. His being a diplomat is important because as a minister representing the American government, he was in Spain for some years. And this particular novel we are going to talk about, The Conquest of Granada, is one of the 5 Spanish novels he did. So he wrote 5 novels on Spain itself, although his stay there was maybe 3 or 4 years. But he was such a prolific writer, so that gave him enough material for 5 books. And this, I thought, is considered a classic, The Conquest of Granada. This conquest, relates to the life of Columbus. Columbus was from Spain and a great adventurer, It is he who discovered America in 1498. And he discovered so many other places, including Granada. In fact, this he conquered because there was already population there. Washington Irving wrote another famous book, The Life and Adventures of Columbus, the voyage of the life and adventures of Columbus. And this is a kind of sequence to the same, the conquest of Granada, 1829. So here again, it is one of the adventures of Columbus, which is being described here. How the local population does put up a resistance, but then a larger than life-size hero, Columbus, he conquers Granada. So this again becomes the quality of romance, because the hero, the character here, is larger than life size, and obviously he has to be in that tradition. By the way, romance narrative or romantic novel inherits the epic, because in ancient times these very qualities of having characters larger than life size, of having themes of a general consequence rather than related to individuals, these two qualities were the main qualities of the epic. Third, of course, the use of the supernatural or the unusual, something not ordinarily come across in life. So these three components of the epic, they are directly inherited by the historical romances of America. And epic also, were largely based on history. Even our own epics, or the Greek epics, or later the medieval British epics, they were all based on history. But then history is treated in such a manner, that's where romance comes to play its part, that the characters become legendary. Events become supernatural, as if they are not ordinary human beings playing their parts. They are superhumans fallen from heavens onto the earth. So it is this kind of narrative that you have in the early phase, and the conquest of Granada is again falls in the same category of historical romance. So these two early American novels, they are not actually novels, they are historical romances, but then loosely or popularly or in terms of history, we call them novels, because fiction, the generic term, is appropriated by novel, because novel then took over and knocked out all other forms of the narrative. That's why even today it is the novel which is continuing, and all other forms, even romance or the allegorical epic or allegorical novel, all those, history, allegory, romance, they have become the components of the novel itself. So novel now has become the dominant form, and others have become just the components, the features, the elements of the novel. So the next in line, we find a slightly different sort of fiction, that is mid 19th century, 1850 onward. And right in the middle of the century, 1850, you have the Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne, the first major American novelist who is taught everywhere, here, there, and everywhere. So the first important American novelist, Nathaniel Hawthorne, so he gave us a form of novel which is part romantic, part realistic or historical, and then is a part romantic and part allegorical. So all these three features, history, allegory, romance, all three are so blended into a perfect form, homogeneous, that this becomes a real classic of the American fiction and the first great novel. As for the story, there is that woman Hester Prynne. Hester Prynne is brought to shame. She is brought to stand on the public platform, scaffold, with a letter A, hanging in her front, which she has very decoratively made, because she is not ashamed of that. Now that factor, to my mind, is very important. It is important because from the gender viewpoint, here is a female character who, despite a very oppressive society, the Puritan society, who would not hesitate to kill anyone deviating from the path laid down by them, where there were definite do's and don'ts. You can do this, you cannot do that. So you could not deviate from the book. So Puritans were known for that, and Hawthorne brings out the cruelty. Cruelty not merely against others like the Red Indians, others like the other followers of different faiths, because Red Indians were not the only ones. There were several other smaller communities who followed religions other than the Christian or other than the Puritan. But these Puritans will not tolerate any other, therefore they are out to wipe out everyone. Now, Hester Prynne is being brought to book because she has a baby called Pearl, very important. Pearl, again, a precious stone. She considered her precious. That's why the name Pearl. But she does not reveal the name of the father. Again, an act of boldness. She could have easily revealed and get away from the punishment, but she does not. So, in her defiance, and a confident defiance, she isn't sorry for all this. Here is a woman who is heroic. So Hawthorne really means to portray her as a heroic character. And at the same time, Hawthorne is out to expose the hypocrisies of the Puritans, that all this humbug about morality is a hoax, because ultimately who is the man involved in this adultery? He is a Puritan father. He's a pastor of the area. It is he who has committed the adultery. And he's a coward. He doesn't come out. And the woman is bold. And to protect him, she does not reveal the name. Otherwise, she could have done it. He was present there. And ironically, it is he who extracts her confession. As a pastor, he makes her confess the adultery and so on. So Hawthorne makes it ironic. Look at the hoax. Look at the pretensions of the Puritans. Here is a man who is acting as very pious and seeking her penance so that she can die in peace. After the last confession, she can die in peace. That's what he is doing. Well, this goes on. Ultimately, they keep meeting secretly. And there comes a stage when Hester proposes. She says, if Puritan society is cruel and callous and oppressive, why must we continue living here? The world is larger than this continent. We can run away to another, Europe, which is neighboring. Let's go there. He says, yes, we can do that. The timid man as he is dominated for a while, momentarily, and out of strong emotion for her, he says, yes, we'll do that. But when the time comes, he retreats, and he doesn't have the courage to take that bold step. And then he goes back and delivers a sermon and so on. But then in the whole struggle, the internal struggle, and that is the theme of the novel, both Hester and Dimmesdale, they are going through an internal churning of the soul. Now, one is not able completely to rise to the occasion. He rises, but halfway, and then collapses. That's why he dies after that sermon. But Hester Prynne rises to the occasion, and she does not get broken down by her so-called ignominious event, and she continues living. And ultimately, the same letter A, which stood for adultery, later became angelic. So it was her courage to fight and to give a new direction to the Puritan society. She actually, momentarily at least, pulls them out of that mentality and shows them the way that there is a more liberal, rational, humane way of life. And even if you consider it some sort of sin, there is scope for pardon. Even your own Puritanism, your own Christianity has this provision for pardon. So rather than hang people or put them to shame and carry them or make them carry this ignominious letter A all their life, you can be more reasonable. So this is the lesson she imparts to the Puritan society. So I would say very bold on the part of Hawthorne himself. He's a male writer and writing in America where Puritanism was very strong, and writing at a time when Puritanism still had a hold on the American society. Nobody could dare challenge it, at least openly. But in writing, there is always a challenge. I had a quotation by somebody, which is in the context of slavery, but I think it's very very significant. Reform Act of 1867. Sorry, you can't easily find. My papers are jumbled, but it was somewhere here. Anyway, by and by we'll come to it when we come to Uncle Tom's Cabin. So these are the two historical romances of the first phase of the American novel, which means the early 19th century.
Yes.
Later 19th century changes. There is a greater hold of the novel rather than romance. Not that the romance is out, it's not out. It is still there. But you see, equation slightly changes. And therefore, rather than history, which is the subject of romances or the epics, in the novel you have a life of individuals, not historical life, individual life. That's why Hawthorne picks up Esther Prynne, an individual. And what happens to her? Novel also focuses on the domestic, on the private, on the personal. History will be public. But novel will go into the interior of life, how the individual feels, thinks, lives. That becomes the area of investigation, and the narrative follows that line. So it becomes more interiorized in a way. It does not remain in the public domain. History is in the public domain. So novel that way is not historical. Romances are, epics are. So Hawthorne picks up an individual and goes into her private life and gives us all that happens inside her, how she feels, how she faces. And in the process, Hawthorne also makes out a difference between what was and what is. What was in Europe and what is there in America. Because when she is on the scaffold facing the ignominy, she can't talk to anyone and she has to keep standing for hours together there. So what does she do? How does she sustain herself? She could have collapsed. But then there are sources of sustenance, and that is her past life on the other continent. So she recalls her childhood. She recalls how she lived with her parents and the English society and the European life there, that mode of life, and how it it was so very different from the life she is facing now. Because there the hold of religion was not that strong, because it was the period of the Renaissance. During the medieval ages, the hold was that strong. So medieval, life was completely in the clutches of religion. It was the Church of Rome that ruled entire Europe, not the kings. Kings were, subservient to the church. But now during the Renaissance, the authority of the church had been challenged. And the Renaissance thinkers, they were pleading for individual conscience. And it suited the Puritans also, because Puritanism was against medievalism and they were for individual conscience. But Renaissance was much more than that. It was rational, it was scientific, and it was more social than individual. So all this Hawthorne shows indirectly through her recall of the past life, which becomes the source of strength for her. And that's why she is able to withstand the ignominy, that moment there on the scaffold. Without that, she might have collapsed. She would have become a victim. But with that strong strength, she comes out and faces the world and keeps facing until the end, unless she transforms the very meaning of the letter A from adulteress to the angelic character. So, great novel, and elements of history, romance, and novel all fused together. Similar kind of novel. Some critics prefer to call it philosophic romance. Philosophic because Hawthorne is trying to reach the bottom of the theme, of the subject. What is sin after all? What the Puritans make out of it is that the meaning? And by the narrative he proves negatively that it is not. And it is something which relates to the individual conscience and not to any paraphernalia of the ritualized or institutionalized religion. Puritanism is institutionalized. So here is an individual fighting against an institution. So these are the polarities in the novel. Now similarly, you have the next one by Herman Melville. Herman Melville wrote again a great classic novel, Moby Dick. Moby Dick or the Whale, that's the full title. Moby Dick or the Whale. Well, Melville had great knowledge of the whaling industry, which was at Chicago. And whale, you know, it eats fishes, it feeds on fish, and it's a huge sea animal. And Melville was fascinated by this, because there were fishermen, or here whalemen, who would be fighting against the whale for days together, unless they finally succeed in hunting this huge animal and then bring it back home. So in Chicago there was a huge industry of whales. So how it was hunted, how it was brought sailing back to the factory, to the industry, and how then the people there involved in cutting it into pieces, packing it, and then mailing it as meat for people, so on and so forth. So huge industry in which thousands of people in America, Chicago was the center, were involved. So he is fascinated by the very heroism of these hunters, these whale hunters, who launch this epic fight. He saw a sort of epic battle. The epic heroes, larger than life itself, had their own supernatural and fights against gods and demons, so on and so forth, supernatural beings. But Melville saw that this animal is no less than the supernatural. The huge animal living in nature in the sea, not among humans, and throwing challenge to humanity. Come and say, kill me if you can. So this challenge, he thought, was no less than an epic theme. So he picked up this fight and shows how the fight between the hunter and the whale spread over days together. There come moments when you are down, discouraged, almost sinking in your courage. But there are moments when your determination pulls you back out of that depression, and you are determined to continue the fight and go until the end. Yes. Oh, sorry. We have reached only the third one. Okay, we'll wind up. So this is that kind of epic battle. If you remember later, Hemingway wrote a similar kind of novel, The Old Man and the Sea.
Yes.
The old man launches a similar kind of fight against the fish. And finally, after 3 days and nights together fighting, he brings back the fish which he has killed. So heroic battle. Similarly here. So next comes, this was the fourth one.
Yes, yes, sir.
Very good. The last one, 5 only for today. The last is Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher, Beecher, Stowe, Stowe. Well, remarkable because this was the first great novel by a woman. Imagine. Cooper was the first man to have written against the eradication of the Indians. But the first woman writes against slavery. How the Negroes from Africa, they are being brought and kept as slaves. So great novel. And imagine, she was from an aristocratic family, white family, North American, and yet having such a strong feeling against the injustice, the inhumanity involved in the whole business of slave keeping. So she shows how a pair of slaves, man and wife, they are running from slavery for freedom. But there are whites who are slave catchers, and he catches them. But there are people on the white side also who are against slavery, like Stowe herself, Mrs. Stowe herself was. So they fight this, slave catcher, and they help this pair to flee, to run away. So this again is a very powerful, very moving story and a real classic in American fiction. So I think 5 is good enough for a day, and we will stick to this 5 next time.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. And just as you told us, you discussed Uncle Tom's Cabin, and you said that the writer was an aristocrat. She came from a white aristocratic family, and despite that, she had so much empathy that she wanted to write about the blacks and the slavery that they went through. And so then, is this a kind of novel which is private and personal, as we talked about when we were discussing Scarlet Letter, or is it a different kind of a novel?
No, it's historical.
Historical. Okay.
Because here is a larger problem of the blacks. Now they are called African Americans. To begin with, they were called Negroes.
Yes.
Then they were called blacks, so on and so forth. In fact, not even Negroes. They were called niggers.
Yes.
Niggers, contemptuous word for them. But here is a woman from an aristocratic family and defying the community.
Yes.
And saying the truth. That we are inhuman. We may be proud of our superior race. Where is the superiority? Inside, you are meaner than these people. You are inhuman. So this is what Mrs. Stowe shows in the novel. That's why it became a classic. Later it was converted into drama. And it was staged in America. Not only in America, it was staged in England. And in England, it had such an impact that the Second Reform Bill of 1867 came, which improved the condition of the workers, of the lower strata of people. So, revolutionary novel, revolutionary literature.
Right.
This shows how literature can be revolutionary. Absolutely. It can change societies.
Yes.
It can change nations, not merely individuals.
Yes, absolutely, sir. And we just got, in fact, been told by sir that it's a historical novel. In a way, it is different from Scarlet Letter, which is a psychological novel of private and personal, discussing the interior of life, what goes on in the inner consciousness of the protagonist and other characters. And sir, can we then also say that the novel we discussed earlier, Conquest of Granada, is also a historical novel or a historical romance?
It is historical but more romance than novel.
Right.
Because in romance you use stunning sort of incidents. For example, in this novel, what we see is the brutal murder of a child. Killing is one thing, but brutally killing is another.
Yes.
So that is the difference between novel and romance. Romance will exaggerate. Romance will take it to the highest pitch of the event, so that your passions, your instincts, your emotions are carried to the extreme. So this is what romance does, and this is what happens in the novel also.
Novel also. Okay, sir. Thanks a lot for telling us that. And sir, when we were discussing the Scarlet Letter, we discussed that it's part romantic, it's part historical, and it's part allegorical. And can we say that this form, after having been read and discussed in the Scarlet Letter, was it used later also? Was it able to inspire other writers as well, or was it a unique?
Yeah, you're right. You see, in fact, the Scarlet Letter became a sort of model,
right,
for the subsequent American novel to come. So it became archetypal. All other writers until late in the 20th century, until the middle, see, this acted as an archetypal model,
right,
for others, where a proper mixture of history, romance, and everyday life novel. So all the three fused together, an excellent combination. That is what he had done.
right. Thank you, sir. And when we talked about the very initial novel, we were discussing The Last of the Mohicans, and you talked about the characters are not just characters in themselves, but they stand for something larger. As we talked about the characters Duncan, Haywood, and Alice Munro, that these were the founding parents of the, say, the American race on the continent, and you talked about them standing, these ideas standing for larger themes, and the issues are not just within the novel, but they are larger issues. So can you say a bit about that, sir?
Yeah, certainly. This is in fact more historical,
right,
than Uncle Tom's
Yes,
Cabin
yes,
or the Scarlet Letter, because it deals with the earliest phase,
absolutely,
the foundational phase of America and American history. So in the foundational phase, the forces were elemental.
right,
You have a European community of Puritans come to the new continent, and you have the native inhabitants, the Red Indians. So two poles apart, civilizations,
absolutely,
religions, faiths, communities. So they coming into clash, and one being superior technologically, succeeding in wiping out the other. So it has those strong elements of history, romance, and some element of the novel.
right. And sir, can we then also call this the first classic American novel, Last of the Mohicans?
Yeah, sure. Of course, Cooper wrote, as I said, a lot of leather stocking novels, and he was the first great American novelist. Even today, he has a very strong place in the history of the American novel, because he has immortalized the Red Indian life as it was in the earliest phase of American history.
Right,
Thereafter, you don't really see them.
right,
Whatever they are, live in a corner and
Right.
almost invisible.
so he's supposed to have given them the most voice and the most visibility.
Yes,
to the
they
Red
still
Indians.
live in the pages of his
Novels.
So one can always go back and recall what America was like
Right,
in the early 19th century.
right,
So Cooper has that historical significance as a novelist,
right,
as a chronicler of American history.
right, right. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us and talking to us about the classics of American fiction. And he has, of course, chosen a few representative texts, and as he was mentioning, there or of course many more, but due to the time constraints we have to choose a few which we have discussed in today's lecture. So with this, friends, you'd like to sign off, and not without thanking sir. Thank you so much, sir, again.
Thank you.
Thank you, viewers, for watching. Have a wonderful day ahead.